As we begin our trip around the globe, exploring what the future world may look like, it is important to remember that all of us, even the best macro analysts and investors in the world, cannot be experts in every country. Yet it is possible to learn enough to keep one's finger on the pulse of the world, to get a sense of the pieces on the global game board. That's something really special about macro and geopolitical analysis. It rewards the generalist. When approaching macro analysis, it is very important to find the best minds who specialize in different areas, to listen to different voices. Just think about all of the conflicting ideas in your own home country, how seemingly no two people can agree on what is even going on. That is the same for every country in the world. Find smart voices, find different voices, and think holistically. Someone who is an expert in one country may have no idea what is going on with the global order. What is necessary is a big picture view, the ability to view all of the pieces on the global game board. And so, as we explore where the world is going, let's begin with Latin America and the Caribbean. When diving into this region and the Western Hemisphere at large, there's no more glaring a change than the Donroe Doctrine. Its predecessor that it earns its name from, the Monroe Doctrine, can be traced back to the 1820s, where it is often attributed to President James Monroe's 1923 State of the Union address. In these days, the vast colonial empires of Europe were dominating the planet. The Americans under Monroe did not wish to see lands in their hemisphere dominated by such powers. Often, many refer to the Monroe Doctrine as if it were America stating that the Western Hemisphere were its empire. Yet, in its original formulation, it was very anti-imperial. The idea was that the nations of the hemisphere should be free from the influence and control of the European powers. On the part of the Americans, there were both pragmatic and philosophical interests. The Americans were concerned that the Europeans would recolonize and solidify their grip over territories so close to the United States, undermining not only the sovereignty of the Latin American nations, but threatening America's and its strategic interests. America was looking outward, and America itself wanted to expand its territory and economic sphere. There was a fear that European powers could establish a foothold, limiting America's potential rise. There were as well softer and more philosophical motivations. There was a republican, anti-monarchic, and anti-imperial ethos in the young America, and America as well was trying very hard not to involve itself in any entanglements with the European powers. And perhaps with a degree more abstraction, there was a sense that if the United States could enforce this, it would very powerfully signal that the United States was on par with the European empires, a nation not to be trifled with. So what makes today's Donroe Doctrine the same? And what makes it different? Well, to a great extent, it's the same idea. It's just adapted for the modern world. There are certainly real threats in Latin America. There are large crime syndicates. There are hostile states. And there are vast natural resources of strategic importance. Resources which America doesn't want to be controlled by foreign powers. Yet it isn't really the Latin American nations themselves, nor is it the cartels, that are at the heart of American concern. Now, just as it had been in the 19th century, the concern at the core of the Donroe Doctrine is the presence of foreign powers. Certainly the Europeans just as before, however this time with the addition of a Chinese consideration. Latin America is extremely resource-rich. Metals, wood, livestock, and substantially, drugs. And there are foreign powers with their own interests over these resources. The nations of Latin America have never truly been sovereign. Throughout the 20th century, American and European intelligence have infiltrated and manipulated Latin American countries, affecting color revolution and regime change operations. One prime example of this sort of operation is the 1954 Guatemalan coup. American intelligence would project a story, stating that communists were on the verge of taking over. Now this was a little true, a little untrue, but functionally a lie. At the same time, there are very important interests in the fruit-growing territory of Guatemala, particularly on the part of the United Fruit Company, a firm which powerful figures, including CIA Director Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, had close links to. American intelligence would back guerrilla forces, installing a new Guatemalan government, and securing the growing lands needed for the fruit company. Though this is the most famous example, this is far from the only instance of American or European government overthrows, infiltrations, or color revolutions. Yet when considering Latin America, one shouldn't myopically focus on the governments themselves. In much of Latin America, the criminal enterprises rival, or in many cases exceed, the official governments. When people think of cartels, they often think of a structure that's something like a crime syndicate from a mafia movie. One big powerful boss giving orders to lieutenants who carry it out through a chain of command. Yet many of the cartels of Latin America operate more like vast distributed webs. There indeed are powerful and organized syndicates. Certainly the power of figures like Pablo Escobar can't be questioned. Yet by and large, it's a distributed phenomenon. It's a way of doing things, it's a business, and it's a mode of corruption. There are many Latin American governments which are functionally under the direction of cartels, whether by corruption or fear. Quite often, organized crime cannot be decoupled from Latin American governments, and for decades, this has been interwoven with foreign intelligence and militaries. The criminal markets, smuggling routes, and laundering hubs across the region are enormous. The sheer enormity of these operations is staggering, and so when one considers the scale, and knows just how frequently and with how much ease American, British, and European intelligence have taken over governments, how reasonable is it to say that in America's own backyard, it just oopsed and has no ability to get a grip on the organized crime? One would have to believe that the United States is the most extraordinary power in all the world, capable of easily toppling governments. Yet when it comes to Mexico, a country that it borders, these gigantic and intelligence agency-linked cartels are simply something that can't be handled. That is untrue. These vast networks have operated for decades because they were permitted to operate, and perhaps more than that, encouraged to operate. So think back to what the Monroe Doctrine was at its core, telling foreign empires not to get involved in America's backyard. While the remnants of those empires continued to exist, just not in territorial form. Remnants of the French Empire across Africa, manipulating commodity prices, corrupting governments, agitating for chaos when governments move against them, maintaining financial dominance, and using monetary systems like the Central African franc to maintain influence over commodity flows. Remnants of the Dutch Empire, operating through conglomerates, and substantial sway over shipping and insurance. Very powerful old Spanish imperial families, maintaining networks from the days of Spanish imperial monopolies, maintaining commercial, influence, and relationship networks that continue to project Spanish interest across Latin America, and with the greatest scale of all, the vast power of London banking and United Kingdom intelligence agencies, continuing to project British power in the region. In particular, British, French, Dutch, and Swiss networks are heavily integrated with Latin American organized crime via offshore money laundering hubs. If one is to consider a vast distributed organized crime network, what would actually give such a network organization and direction? What are the centralizing nodes, the places where power can be applied? Well, those would be the laundering banks, and some of the most powerful laundering hubs in the world exist across the Caribbean and in Canadian banks, tied back to London. As these are the modern instantiations of empires, to apply the Donroe Doctrine today, the United States would need to make a move against these laundering networks, these smuggling routes, the NGOs which continue to manipulate politics, and the power and influence of European intelligence agencies. Instead of telling the Spanish military to stand down, or sailing your fleet out to intercept British frigates, today, securing the backyard would mean going after international entities like these, and in particular, the organized crime networks, the NGOs, and the offshore money laundering havens, particularly those tied in with the London-Geneva axis. We've begun to see inclinations of this approach. In early 2025, a series of Latin American cartels were designated as foreign terrorist organizations, and the American administration began to move more aggressively against the cartels in a way that hadn't been seen before. This included actions on the part of OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. Some very large sanctions would result, identifying criminal assets, including money laundering centers, shell companies, criminal real estate investments, smuggling routes, and fraud schemes. There appears to be a very clear recognition that if one wants to reduce the power of these organized crime networks, if one wants to remove foreign influence, then one must focus on the infrastructure of the cartels. The pace would pick up rapidly as 2025 went on. In June, FinCEN would designate 3 sizable Mexican banks as money laundering concerns, and in December, FinCEN would begin an enormous data sweep, looking at money service businesses, particularly those along the Mexican border. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent would refer to this as going after, quote, terrorist cartels. And this isn't just a rhetorical shift. Shifting in official policy away from regarding these networks and organizations as criminal networks to terrorist ones kicks into gear some very different government systems and actions, allowing the use of some toys that haven't been played with in quite some time. Yet this wouldn't just stop at banks and normal financial institutions. Beginning in November of 2025, FinCEN would go after Sinaloa cartel-controlled gambling operations. And as of today, the operations of FinCEN seem to only have accelerated. The Department of Justice appears to have reordered, structuring themselves in a way indicative of this being their primary mission. More narcotics and money laundering experts were brought on board, and extraditions, particularly against money launderers, have ramped up substantially. In a meeting with Colombian President Gustavo Petro, Petro would tell President Trump that if he wanted to go after the cartels, his best line of attack would be to go after the banks in America itself. It's not only the criminal banks across Latin America. It's not only the offshore havens, like those in the Caribbean. It is some of the largest money center banks in the world, banks on Wall Street and in Toronto. And quite curiously, around the time that the meeting with the Colombian president was occurring, and it began to become evident that there was an increased focus on the money laundering banks, the powerful Canadian-based Egmont Group, an organization designed to track financial crime, would begin limiting its information that was being shared with the Americans. Now, this piece in the puzzle is difficult to get details on. It's difficult to substantiate exactly what happened here. But what appears to be the case is that the anti-money laundering organizations of Canada and Europe do not wish to cooperate with the Americans now that they're taking it seriously. And this goes back to a question that we have begged for quite some time. Just how integrated are the European governments with organized crime? Just how complicit are the large banks? And the answer is increasingly becoming obvious. Not only are they knowledgeable about all of this, but they are intentional facilitators. Yet, there is another entity that we haven't looked at yet. While much is talked about the sheer scale of the London banking network and the subtlety of the Swiss networks, there is an additional foreign interest that has been playing a quite large role in this situation: the Chinese. As organized crime, smuggling routes, and laundering networks have come under American scrutiny, the presence of Chinese organizations has been reliable. It has become quite common knowledge that fentanyloid precursors very often originate from Chinese ports, while additionally, Chinese organizations appear to be involved within the smuggling itself and in money laundering. The Chinese play a very curious role in all of this. For on the one hand, they're, on paper, the United States' greatest adversary. They're the only true rival. And thus, in a Monroe Doctrine sense, it would make sense that the Americans would want to limit Chinese influence in the hemisphere. That certainly does appear to be the case. At least on the part of the White House, the interest is for the Western Hemisphere to be in American hands, and for the Chinese to functionally need to ask permission before operating. Yet there also appears to be increased cooperation between the Americans and the Chinese. Tensions certainly continue, yet there is something cooperative. One very curious question that this begs is which elements within China is America aligning itself with, and which elements is it aligning against? Americans intuitively know that America is not a monolith. In fact, if you ask many people, they'll have the sense that there are functionally at least two separate countries within the land. Yet when people look at foreign countries, they tend to assume that it's of one mind, that it's functionally just one country acting as one entity. Yet other countries are just as divided as the United States. China has multiple factions, and is beginning to look like one of the factions is involved with organized crime, and that this faction has closer links to Hong Kong and the offshore banking network, while another, at least nominally in power, is a more pure nationalist faction, very averse to these foreign financial entities. The Americans appear to be working closer with this faction, a faction including Xi Jinping. Yet there are pluses and minuses to this. On the one hand, as the United States has moved against this financial apparatus, these NGOs and globalist institutions, they have found alignment with this faction in China. This faction in China is threatened by that foreign influence. This faction wishes to eliminate foreign dominance over commodity prices, and this faction has been directly undermined by those who have aligned with these financial powers. There appears to be broad agreement in the remaking of the world order, American and Chinese sovereigntists wishing to end the undue control of the globalist apparatus. Yet at the same time, it can be quite difficult for nationalist factions to cooperate. Both the American and Chinese sovereigntists may be temperamentally disposed to butt heads, both more fundamentally sensitive to the idea of a foreign threat. At least now there appears to be cooperation, but there is real question as to just how stable that cooperation is, and how long it lasts outside the scope of these interests. For one example, there is substantial disagreement around the Panama Canal. The solution appears to be some sort of unspoken equilibrium. The Americans gain control of the hemisphere. The Chinese cooperate in going against foreign criminal influence, money laundering, and smuggling, and align on the larger goal of pushing down European financial power. And in exchange for what is given to the United States, America appears willing to accept a Chinese sphere of influence that it hasn't before, recognizing a sort of Monroe Doctrine parallel for the Chinese, particularly in the South China Sea. So this may be the arrangement that we will see into the future, a pushing back of the modern instantiations of the European empires that operate through finance, organized crime, intelligence, and NGOs, and America protecting the boundaries of the Western Hemisphere, and a China asserting its own sphere around the South China Sea. With the forcing out of these interests, Latin American countries will become able to develop their resources in ways that they have not been able to, all while America supplies investment and builds strategic partnership across the region, to an extent broadening out the American economy. Yet while this is a very big picture view at what appears to be the strategic goal, there are many smaller moving parts. So let's pivot to a more granular look and explore what has been changing on the national government level. The last few years have seen enormous changes in governments across the Western Hemisphere. Not only the election of upstart outsider candidates, but changes so substantial that they change not only the ruling regime, but the ruling system itself. Perhaps one of the most striking ones has been the change in Argentina. The election of Javier Milei began a shift to an entirely different economic model. Prior to Milei taking the office of the president, Argentina had been under the presidency of Alberto Fernandez. During these years, and going back much further, the country had been in dire economic conditions. The country had been operating under an adapted Peronist socialism. The country was in enormous debt, much of it financed through central bank money creation. There was persistent high inflation. Price controls resulted in further disruption. High trade barriers further crunched the economy. And enormous amounts of the economy were operated under a nationalized system, one which got very poor results. While many had become accustomed to the chronic failures of Argentina, thinking of it as a dysfunctional and poor nation, Argentina was at one point the wealthiest place in the world. It has tremendous natural resources, and for a long time many wondered if Argentina could find its way back to prosperity. Well, in 2023, the Argentinians took a gamble and elected Javier Milei. Milei is quite striking because his economic background is in Austrian economics. His philosophy has much in common with libertarians and thinkers like Mises. He came in promising deregulation and austerity. His pitch is one that's typically very difficult for democratic societies to swallow, promising future rewards in exchange for short-term pain. The problem is that in most electorates, people are unwilling to accept the short-term pain. As the future benefits are not guaranteed, quite often electorates choose to go with what sounds the best immediately. Yet things seem to simply be too far gone in Argentina, and they were willing to make this bet. Milei came in with sweeping cuts, large-scale deregulation, heavy austerity, and later a shift to becoming quite friendly with the American regime. As Argentina is so resource-rich, and has aligned itself with the American regime, it appears positioned to be a prime candidate in the new Donroe Doctrine worldview. It seems quite reasonable to expect that the Argentinians will align with American interests, and will show themselves to be highly receptive to cooperating with the Americans and with American investment. In fact, last year, when a currency shock began to put pressure on the Argentinian government, raising question as to whether the Milei regime would be able to continue, the Americans opened up swap lines to the Argentinians, as well as initiating offers of investment, buying Argentinian debt. This not only showed alignment between the Trump and Milei regimes, but was a strong step in intertwining the Americans and Argentinians, both in the money markets and the capital markets. So as we go forward, Argentina is certainly a place to keep a close eye on. It is quite likely that we will see heavy American investment, further cooperation between the two governments, and coming from a place of such a disastrous economy, there is enormous growth potential. Assuming office in 2025, Rodrigo Paz became the president of Bolivia. This was another sharp change in Latin America, ending nearly 20 years of leftist MAS rule. MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo, had operated under the tenets of the process of change, state-led development, redistribution, and resource nationalism. They would heavily make use of subsidies, price controls, heavy export taxes, state control over key natural resources, and would go into heavy debt. Early in this regime, a commodity boom allowed them to be quite prosperous. However, this faded rather quickly. Economic growth slowed to a crawl, and poverty rose. Ultimately, the economic crisis that was created ended in such dissatisfaction that MAS rule ended. The new government is eliminating many subsidies, making substantial tax cuts, cutting an estimated around 30% of public spending, decentralizing national industries, opening up to foreign investment, and beginning sweeping anti-corruption audits. At present, inflation remains elevated, but is showing signs that it will likely decrease. The situation has largely stabilized, but the problems within the country are deep. Growth is still slow, and tensions remain high. So it will remain to be seen just how much change the new government can bring. Yet, much like in the case of Argentina, this appears to be another opportunity for investment and growth. Particularly if we see closening with the American administration, then Bolivia may prove to be in a quite similar situation as Argentina, and perhaps one that fewer investors have yet realized. Brazil is in a much trickier situation. In 2018, right-wing populist Jair Bolsonaro would win in a highly contentious runoff election. The core tenets of his platform would be law and order, anti-corruption, and firm opposition to the leftist factions that made up his opposition. He would engage in more conservative economic policies, including substantial deregulation. He would support digitalization efforts and deregulating the Brazilian economy, one which had become highly regulated and bureaucratic. On the international stage, he would withdraw from some globalist institutions, and he would align himself more with the United States. Yet in 2022, an election would come again. This time, the socialist faction, who had coalesced around Lula da Silva, would beat Bolsonaro in an even more contentious race. He, and indeed many in Brazil, have raised questions as to the veracity of that election, pointing out not only internal inconsistencies, but what appear to be CIA involvement. In January the next year, large mobs would form, storming and ransacking government buildings. Tension in the country was rising. The factions supporting Bolsonaro believed that the elections were illegitimate, and that Da Silva and his backers had effected a coup. Meanwhile, Da Silva and his faction would frame the situation as Bolsonaro attempting to create an army to take back the government by force. Brazil was spiraling quite quickly into very, very serious domestic conflict. However, as Da Silva took office and began to reinstantiate socialist policies, it began to become clear to many that he was not running the government. He was just the figurehead. More and more eyes would turn to Supreme Federal Court Justice Alessandro de Moraes. Through his judicial position, he would begin making sweeping rulings, many of which targeting the faction opposing Lula da Silva, and increasingly becoming extremely restrictive on internet speech. It became so extreme that Brazil was nearing the point of having a functionally separate internet, and many came to view Moraes as the most powerful man, at least public-facing man, in all Brazil. Da Silva, for his part, would increase government involvement in industry, reinstantiate social welfare policies, begin massive spending projects on infrastructure, make changes to tax policy, and back green energy policies, including what has been termed green carbon, for whatever that is. For the extreme level of tension in Brazil, their economy has held up surprisingly well. By late 2024, their unemployment fell to about 7.5%, which is one of the lowest points that it has been in decades. Inflation has remained higher than perhaps Americans may like, though it is in a quite reasonable range for Brazil, hanging out at around 4 or 5%. One looming problem on the horizon, however, is that government spending is very high, and there is real concern as to when that will reach a point of crisis. Returning to the judiciary, Bolsonaro has been banned from seeking office until 2030, and in May of 2025, a trial against him and other officials began. The American Trump administration responded with outrage, clearly siding with Bolsonaro. And while undergoing a medical procedure, Bolsonaro for some time resided in the United States. In July, his home was searched, and an ankle monitor was placed on him. He was brought before the Supreme Federal Court. Ultimately, he was found guilty of a coup attempt, and sentenced to 27 years and 3 months in prison. Something quite curious about this case, however, is that the majority of the court did not rule to convict him. In fact, so many abstained that it was actually a clear minority that voted for this conviction. However, Moraes and his faction, despite not even having a majority of the court, got their conviction, and now tension is very high. Brazil is clearly set up for a conflict between two factions. One, a socialist faction with the support of globalist institutions and some European governments. And another, a nationalist sovereigntist faction aligned with the United States administration. The population is split, and there is very tense opposition between the two. Brazil, like other countries we have looked at, has tremendous natural resources, and coming from its Portuguese background, as opposed to growing out of the Spanish monopoly model, Brazil has some advantages, and it certainly could have an impressive economy if it wanted to. Yet it is an extremely corrupt country. It is currently ruled by a political faction that knows that it is under threat, a faction that is going to extreme lengths to protect itself. Meanwhile, the opposing faction has only become more hardened, and it's very difficult to believe that this powder keg won't explode. One outstanding question is as the Donroe Doctrine moves forward, will the Americans become more involved? Clearly, if this administration involves itself in Brazil, it will be on the side of Jair Bolsonaro. So for an investor or analyst looking at Brazil, it will be very worthwhile to take seriously just how hot this conflict can get. The government of Chile as well experienced a sharp shift to the right. Elected in 2025, President José Antonio Cast begins his term in March of this year. He appears poised to be the most right-wing leader of Chile since Pinochet. Prior to this presidency, the government had engaged in center-left to progressive policies, focusing heavily on state-led development and social inclusion initiatives. Despite economic difficulties, Chile had been in a milder position. There were quite substantial poverty and crime concerns, yet overall the economy was relatively stable, with rather slow but moderate growth. Cast framed his campaign as an emergency government, focusing on issues of immigration, crime, economic liberalization, and a broader notion of restoring order. While it's too early to see how this government will pan out, one can reasonably expect stronger policing, a harsher crackdown on crime, mass deportations, tax cuts, significant public spending decreases, conservative social policies, and stronger American alignment. Colombia will be facing an election this year. Elected in 2022, Colombian President Gustavo Petro moved the country sharply to the left. Perhaps his most signature policy is attempting to negotiate peace with organized crime and militant groups, aiming for ceasefires and demobilization. This has achieved a degree of success. The instances of violence have decreased, yet these groups nor their violence have been eliminated, with pockets of violence persisting, particularly in rural areas. The Petro government has raised taxes, attempted to increase state control over the healthcare system, initiated a public-private pension scheme, pushed to end oil exploration, enacted land redistribution policies, backed progressivist social policies, and has generally shifted closer to countries like Venezuela and Cuba, Latin American countries with socialist governments. With respect to the upcoming election, a more right-wing candidate appears to be the most likely winner, particularly with support for anti-corruption and economic liberalization. The Colombians are in a curious spot, for they are in one of the most key nodes of the international drug trade. And while the Petro government is much less aligned with the United States, there appears to be some emerging cooperation. Despite just how prevalent corruption is, at least from what can be seen, Petro appears to have genuine concern around organized crime and militants. And it looks like he may even be supportive of American efforts to eliminate these networks. So there are many questions about the future of Colombia. If they shift rightward in the next election, will this mean further alignment with the United States? And otherwise, will Petro align further with the United States? It may be particularly difficult to make this argument to some of the older leftist factions, particularly the anti-imperialist Marxists, who have the United States of the 20th century just too deeply ingrained in their psyche. Even as America is changing its relationship with the world, that might just be too far for some in Latin America to take. Yet this is a country to keep quite a close eye on, because it is such a central node in the international drug production and smuggling networks. And if we see further cooperation with the Americans, then the end result could be a very, very different Colombia. And as a result, a very different Latin America and United States. Cuba appears to be of increasing concern to the United States. As of recording, and I note that because this could change quite quickly, Cuba remains a one-party state under the rule of the Communist Party, and current Secretary and President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. Back in January of 2025, President Joe Biden began a series of easing policies with respect to the Cubans, removing them from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and easing restrictions on the country. Very shortly after President Trump took office, this was reversed. And in June, he would increase restrictions, including new travel restrictions. Yet real moves began in 2026. Beginning in January, Following the capture of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, the Americans would restrict the supply of Venezuelan oil from Cuba. Only a few weeks after, new sanctions would be implemented on those involved in supplying the Cubans, beginning a new sanctions regime. More recently, the rhetoric has shifted harsher, with the president stating that regime change in Cuba is only a matter of time. Blocking Cuba's access to oil has caused severe economic hardship. The Americans have begun allowing some private entities to acquire oil, but continuing to limit the state. And as economic conditions have worsened, the Cubans have begun showing a willingness to negotiate. The administration has suggested a friendly takeover, and perhaps there could be something within this model, some sort of deal that could be struck between the two nations. Particularly considering the United States' ability to regime change, the possibility of a major change in Cuba is quite probable. And so as we go forward, it would be quite reasonable for an analyst to keep an eye on Cuba and consider that it might be rolled into the American sphere. Elected in 2024, El Salvador's Nayib Bukele began an enormous wave of anti-crime policies. In fact, El Salvador went from being one of the most dangerous places in all the world to perhaps one of the safest. His anti-crime regime appears to have been remarkably successful. Bukele may be one of the most extreme examples of Latin American regime shifts moving against the organized crime elements. Bukele has certainly drawn the ire of many globalist leaders, figures, and institutions, those who one might expect to be getting a little cut of the organized crime. There has, however, been some tension with the Americans, as there is concern on the part of the American administration that Bukele's anti-crime policies resulted in El Salvadoran criminals simply leaving for the United States. This appears to be getting largely resolved, with very strong signs of alignment between the Americans and El Salvadorans. Considering the frame of the Donroe Doctrine, and just how pivotal addressing organized crime and laundering is, it appears very likely that Bukele may be one of the American administration's strongest allies in this endeavor. Assuming office in January of 2026, Nasre, nicknamed Tito Asfora, has initiated a right-wing nationalist government for Honduras. Similar to other newly elected leaders that we have looked at, a big part of his government is anti-corruption. The policies of Asfora and his party, the National Party of Honduras, are reduction in the size of the state, a decrease in government spending, pro-business policies and investment incentives, decentralization, building infrastructure, and substantially increased alignment and ties with the United States. Honduras appears to be another country in this mold that are poised to closely align with the United States in the aims of the new Donroe Doctrine. So for the analyst or the investor, Honduras could be another example of these opportunities that are arising. Particularly with close cooperation with the United States, Honduras may see very large waves of foreign investment. Launching in 2025, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has initiated Plan Mexico, planning $277 billion in public-private investment, aims at the construction of building infrastructure, initiating tax reforms and narrowing the budget, and simultaneously initiating minimum wage hikes. Mexico's economic growth has been relatively slow, and Mexico is another example of a country that could have much more robust growth. While there is foreign investment, with one notable example being the investments of foreign car manufacturers, one major problem facing Mexico is that foreigners are afraid to invest. Mexico just appears too unstable, and it's clear that criminal elements run the country. Organized crime in Mexico is a curious thing. While there are organized and centralized elements, much of it is decentralized. And while yes, there may be these shadowy bosses living in mansions up on the hills surrounded by guards, functionally many of its bosses are the Mexican government itself. They can't be disentangled. So what do you do when organized crime and your government cannot be separated out? What do you do when a cartel boss is a judge? Well, that's the predicament that the anti-cartel elements in the Mexican government and the American government are now contending with. Over the past year, the American government has made substantial moves against Mexican crime, focusing particularly on money laundering operations. For quite a while, Sheinbaum has appeared resistant to these American activities, stating that she values Mexican sovereignty first, not wanting the Americans to take action in the country. Yet there have been some more curious statements recently, sending a message of, "Look, I want to take care of them, but I just can't. I'm not a free actor." And that comes back to the problem of the entanglement of government and cartel in Mexico. What do you do when your government is the cartels? How do the American and Mexican governments work together when that means the Americans and the Mexican cartels are working together against the Mexican cartels? It is a very deep problem. Yet, there appears to be some progress. Perhaps slow and steady, but certainly steady. Mexico has been extraditing criminals, and while Sheinbaum has been continuing to operate under a hugs not bullets policy, she appears to be beginning to give way and accepting some harder American action. She and her government have been cooperating more on anti-smuggling measures, and though the tension hasn't been ameliorated, the direction appears to be converging on some sort of understanding. Perhaps more than any country in the region, Mexico is going to be the most difficult one to tackle, for crime is just too deeply entrenched in the Mexican government, and particularly as Mexico borders the United States, it has become such an enormous criminal economy. There is opportunity in Mexico, and it appears that it could be a place that could house substantial industry. Its mining and gas industries, for example, are quite spectacular. Yet so much is going to come down to how the cartel situation is addressed. The Americans could move unilaterally if they wanted to, yet at least at present, the Trump administration appears resistant to push too far. The White House seems to want cooperation, and is angling towards some sort of deal. Much of this will most likely remain unspoken, subtle, for even if Sheinbaum were to jump on board with the American approach, she could not say so publicly. So as we go forward, it will be worthwhile to look at the subtle moves. Actions like the extraditions, like OFAC, FinCEN, moves against gambling operations, non-bank money laundering operations, and military and law enforcement operations against smuggling and trafficking routes. This will be very pivotal to the overall American goal. Yet if these elements are eliminated, Mexico could prove to be one of the greatest opportunities in the entire region, becoming perhaps one of America's closest friends. Beginning in 2024, Panama's government has as well experienced a rightward shift, though this one more moderate, moving from center-left to center-right. The new government under President Jose Raul Mulino seems focused on business and investment. Panama has as well adopted more fiscal austerity measures and taken a tougher stance on immigration. Previously, Panama had begun to move closer with the Chinese, entering into China's Belt and Road Initiative. Yet under the new president, it's very clearly moved toward the United States. Panama is of particular importance because of the canal, and recently, issues surrounding the canal have become much more pressing. The Trump administration has taken the stance that China has obtained too much control over the canal, and has asserted that the United States will take it back. In January, Panama's Supreme Court ruled that the renewal of a 25-year concession had been unconstitutional, paving the way for the United States to reassert itself over the canal. The Chinese responded with outrage, stating that Panama would pay a heavy price. Prior to this point, the Hong Kong-based C.K. Hutchinson, a firm owned by Li Ka-shing, had operated 2 key ports in the canal. Yet following this ruling, new players spotted an opportunity, as Hutchinson was losing its position. Since then, a BlackRock-led consortium has announced a purchase of $23 billion in port assets. The Chinese have asserted that this is unacceptable, and that the assets ought to remain as they had before. The more American-aligned President Mulino, however, has stated that the territory is Panama's sovereign domain, and that it can do as it sees fit. The moves have been rapid since then. Most recently, The company Costco Shipping Lanes and OOCL, its Hong Kong affiliate, have redirected service routes along the canal. This situation is becoming more tense. On the one hand, there are the Chinese interests, heavily concentrated in Hong Kong firms, and on the other, there is the American Donroe Doctrine position, which holds that it's unacceptable for China to have that much control over such a vital route in America's hemisphere. Panama has stated that its position is of national sovereignty, and while this may be the case, functionally under the current government, that means closer American alignment. At present, it looks most likely that those port assets are going to end up in the American sphere, and as the Americans and Chinese negotiate new arrangements in the coming global order, all indications point to the Panama Canal remaining in the American sphere. Yet one question that does remain is whether the United States will give any concessions to the Chinese in exchange for them standing down. The canal is an extremely vital asset to the global economy, and so when it comes to the global game board and who can assert what influence across the globe, this conflict over the canal could prove to be a very vital piece on the board. Peru is a very messy situation. The country is extremely fragmented, with no clear dominant faction. Indeed, the country has had 6 presidents since 2016. The current president, Jose Herri, only assumed office in October 2025, after the impeachment of the previous president, Dina Boluarte. Hello, it's me from only a couple weeks later. That interim president was also removed, being ousted on grounds of corruption. The new president is Jose Maria Balcazar. While there are very sharp divisions within the country, fractured not between 2 distinct factions but several, there's an overall sense of fatigue amongst the population, with a deep distrust of the political class as a whole. As it becomes more clear which direction the government is going to go in, it will be very worthwhile to keep an eye on. As we go forward, Peru may prove significant to the new hemispheric order, yet for now, it's very chaotic. There are several countries that I haven't mentioned, and I've attempted to limit it to the most noteworthy, ones that have either experienced the greatest shifts, or ones that have the most influence. And so the last one that I'm going to address is the one that perhaps amongst all others has gained the most attention, and that's Venezuela. Following the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez has taken over his position. While many have referred to the raid of Maduro as a regime change operation, the regime remains unchanged. The current alignment appears to be that the United States will leave Venezuela to self-govern. However, Venezuela must align with the United States, and it must cooperate with American endeavors for investment and the development of its natural resources. Venezuela could prove to be one of the most undervalued countries in the world. It has extraordinary natural resources, and with American investment and development, could experience incredible prosperity and a burst of wealth. Venezuela is also a key player in the international crime, smuggling, and laundering web, and so as the United States has made its presence there, and particularly should it gain more information from Nicolas Maduro himself, then this could be a very interesting spot to watch for the ripple effects across the international crime web. If Venezuela goes down, what else goes down? And if the natural resources of Venezuela are developed, and the country is now truly freed to develop itself economically, then it could flip from being a poor, troubled, and foreign crime, intelligence, and financial network-dominated nation to a very prosperous country that could be an enormous opportunity for the United States. Broadly, the Americas are experiencing substantial changes. Not only has the United States changed its relationship with the countries, but so many of these nations have moved sharply to the right and toward more libertarian market economics. Argentina moved from socialist to libertarian, Bolivia from the left to the center-right, Chile from the left to the center-right as well, Ecuador from the left to the right, Honduras left to right, and Peru remains to be seen, one of the most unstable of all of them. At the same time, Venezuela experienced its leader being captured by the American military, and now many are holding their breath to see what happens in Cuba. Instability has been endemic to Latin America for quite some time. Earlier on, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many Latin American countries sought to emulate the United States, wishing to become like their democratic republic, a capitalist market system, hoping for industrialization. Yet the philosophy of the American system never quite mapped to Latin America very well, and much of this can be traced back to the Spanish origins. The American system grew out of early modern English ideas, while the colonies that became Latin American countries grew out of the model of the Spanish Empire. Under the Spanish Empire, noble and very wealthy families were granted monopolies. Trade was heavily restricted, and this would ultimately form into a system where oligarchic families control vast natural resources. Yet unlike a sort of English nobility, within the Latin framework, this translated to corruption. Business was done by paying off these families, and trying to map the American system onto this just didn't work. And so countries in Latin America have fluctuated wildly between many different political ideologies, all the while being underneath foreign influence. So one very pressing question is, will the new outlook of the United States change how it looks going forward? If the United States is shifting to a viewpoint that it should act as a partner to these countries, then could these new relationships and arrangements result in a different economic circumstance? That will be something to watch going forward in the coming years. At present, the vast criminal and financial networks that operate throughout the region are a very pressing concern to the United States. If the United States and indeed other sovereigntist countries wish to assert their national interests, then it is going to require these entities to be degraded or eliminated. And particularly with matters of militant groups, smuggling and trafficking routes, and the money laundering centers, the United States most likely will need to build close cooperative partnerships with these countries. There's a lot up in the air, but there's enormous potential. As we go forward, there are some very different looking scenarios that may play out. One is the fulfillment of America's new doctrine. In this scenario, many countries align closer with the United States. Criminal networks are shut down or crippled. American investment pours into countries across Latin America. And as economic stability enters, most likely too comes more political stability, particularly if entanglements with the United States are sufficiently deep. In this scenario, we could see great booms of wealth across many countries. We could see enormous returns to investors in the United States, and perhaps in other countries as well. And we could see violence and crime decrease. This could mean that long undervalued assets see enormous returns. Mines, lumber, gas, oil. The Americas have incredible natural wealth. Yet for so long, corruption and misuse have led to squandering and undervaluing. More signs of this scenario emerging could be ramping up efforts against organized crime and money laundering, new trade and economic relationships between the United States and countries across the hemisphere, and the further solidification of American-friendly governments. Yet, there's also the possibility that this goes wrong. We could see scenarios more like Brazil arise. There is still substantial tension across many of these countries, and the influence of organized crime, foreign intelligence, and NGOs still retains a great deal of influence. It's certainly possible that these cracks could be divided further, that political tensions could be inflamed, or that criminal elements become more violent and destabilizing. This scenario would likely differ between countries, though could be experienced regionally as a whole. Signs that this potentiality is emerging would be quite straightforward. One would see more crime, more conflict, and this would likely correspond to increasing fractures with the United States in some cases, while perhaps in others, national governments align with the United States, yet functional power is retained within non-state actors. If this were to go sufficiently far, then it could warrant a military response. Take, for example, a scenario where a civilian government has aligned with the United States and wants support in dealing with these non-state actors. The United States engages, perhaps lending direct military support. And while the countries are aligned, much of the natural resources and territory remain under non-state control. Now, most likely this can be dealt with, yet some of these entities are deeply entrenched, and many have deep pockets in foreign benefactors. So the worst case scenarios here could look like protracted conflicts, or perhaps a situation where the United States experiences such a sufficient regime shift that the project is forgotten about entirely. The region is allowed to return to the status quo, and the foreign networks of crime and money laundering are left to take over some countries. It will be very worthwhile to keep an eye on the financial elements associated with these networks. If there is sufficient disruption to the money laundering system, then there will almost certainly be ripple effects. One could expect to see damage to banks, some real estate portfolios, money services companies, and quite likely as well, luxury goods businesses. If sufficient damage were done to this network, with respect to the money laundering aspect, then one way that an investor may be able to play it would be to bet against companies like these. Yet at present many scenarios remain, though it looks as though the momentum is toward a rightward shift and in alignment with the United States, all the while the United States increasing its efforts against organized crime, foreign intelligence and NGOs, smuggling, trafficking, and laundering. What has happened for decades in this region is a real shame. There is remarkable potential, and if we are able to see these goals come to fruition, then this long undervalued region could be an enormous place of opportunity. That scenario is quite probable, yet it will warrant keeping an eye on and watching for the signs that arise. Despite all of these years, there's still an ethos in the Western Hemisphere that is different than the Old World. There still is a sense of exploration and risk-taking. Though perhaps that is most manifest in the United States, it exists across the hemisphere, and that ethos is an enormous opportunity. So this will be an area to watch very closely. It is certainly possible that it could go from bad to worse. Yet there are many positive indications arising that a new and positive era could be on the horizon.